Hello and welcome to this second lecture on Martin Hajer's book, The Politics of Environmental Discourse. In this lecture we're going to examine chapter 2, which is the most important chapter in this very important book. Now, let's begin by understanding the particular perspective that Hajer wants to argue. His is a social constructivist analysis. Social constructivism, as you know, is defined in opposition to realism, or the conviction that the world is immanently meaningful, is meaningful separate from our understanding of it. Social constructivism, on the other hand, argues that we are involved in the constitution of the world, in making things meaningful. And Hajer begins with the work of Schatzschneider, who wrote in the 1960s a book on the mobilization of bias, in which he argues that institutions, all forms of political organization, have a bias in favor of the exploitation of some kinds of conflicts and the suppression of others, because organization is the mobilization of bias. Some issues are organized into politics, while others are organized out. Now, that particular quotation is on page 42. And his analysis is a deepening of this because he wants to show how this works through analyzing discourse. So policy-making practices are inherently discursive and argumentative, according to Hajer. And he introduces a series of very, very useful conceptualizations as we begin to analyze public policy. One of them is the idea that coherence is not an essential feature of discourse. He makes this point on page 44, and he defines discourse on that particular page. But this is a very important point, because discourse in and of itself may be a collection of a set of dispositions, a set of sound bites, a set of attitudes, a set of perspectives, which in and of themselves might actually be quite fragmentary, might be quite incoherent, and even self-contradictory. So environmental discourse. What is environmental discourse? Well, it's so many different things, and it ranges from a radical critique that you would find with deep ecologists, organizations and groups like Earth First, to other very accommodationist groups that seek to merely advance environmental agenda, but at the very heart of government, and would not necessarily want to challenge any of the structures that radical environmentalists see as really central to explaining environmental degradation and the declining quality of our way of life and of the world in which we live. Now, context also is very, very important, and he wants to argue that ideas that make sense within one discursive setting may not in public debate and beyond it. Just think of certain ideas which are perhaps expressed in a boardroom, and then if those ideas are actually recorded by a journalist and they get into a newspaper, it's very, very easy to distort these ideas. It's very easy to take public policy discourse, which is articulated in private, and to distort it and to create a scandal from it. But there's a larger important conceptualization here. So what we're dealing with is something which has to have coherence produced around it. And that's a very, very important point, because he wants to move beyond the concept of discourse to a much more precise concept, which is that of storylines. Now, central to this chapter and to the book as a whole is an understanding of the public policy process and how, with a discursive approach, one approaches it in a different way. The pluralist model, or the dominant model, to understand the policy process is one in which you have pre-constituted interest groups, business, labour, environmental organizations, scientists, local politicians and whatnot. You can just think of the various stakeholders that would be operating here. Each of these have different beliefs, and these beliefs are often seen as being belonging to individuals, where you have methodological individualism, or groups. And these organizations, these stakeholders, they cooperate. They come together in advocacy coalitions. Sometimes they're opposed to each other, sometimes they work independently, sometimes they come together. They then interact in the public policy process through pressuring politicians, through raising issues in the media, through confronting civil servants and the like. And the public policy process works using mobilization of bias, in which certain conflicts, certain issues are organized in, certain other issues are organized out. Then you have a particular policy outcome which favors the interests of one of these particular groups. So in the end, the environmentalists win, or in the end, you have a policy which favors big business and also small business. Now, he wants to complicate that particular model, and he wants to get to that model by first of all examining Foucault and Foucault's works. And there he finds sophistication, and he finds an analysis of structures which points to the duality of structures and of discourses, is that discourse can be enabling and constraining. Discourses have structuring capacities themselves. And this is the important point: interests and subjects do not come before discourse. There is no a priori thinking subjects trying to translate preconceived ideas into language. So this is something that should be quite familiar to you from the previous modules that you have looked at, where discourse comes first. So discourse is not a medium through which individuals can manipulate the world as if they are separate from discourse, because we know from previous modules that subjects get their particular identity from being in public institutions, using public language, and being in power relationships which define their identity prior to them themselves even having an understanding of themselves. People are born into a pre-existing world and pre-existing language which structures the world in a certain way. That goes back to principles that Bakhtin and Wittgenstein articulated. So, interests cannot be taken as given a priori. What the particular interest of business, the business class, or what the particular interest of a group of scientists or a group of local entrepreneurs in a particular place is, that has to be worked out through discourse and through argumentation. Now he argues that Foucault's work, on the one hand, addresses the macro level scale, conceptualizations and understandings of discourse as a whole, and then points to certain the microphysics of power. And what he wants to analyze is, he wants to call it the meso level, the in-between level. So he wants to examine institutions, interest groups, and the role of discourse in mediating this particular process. So we have a more complicated understanding of public policy making process as a whole. Now, central to this meso level is the idea of storylines. And storylines gets us beyond the sometimes frustrating vagueness of the concept of discourse. And he wants to argue that the argumentative interaction is a key moment in discursive formation, and it is through arguing, it is through contestation of different ideas promoted by different intellectuals, and through the process of witcraft, which is a term that he takes from Billig and his work on arguing and thinking from the 1980s. He wants to argue that we need to look at skills of argumentation and their role in the public policy making process. Now, when you think about it, this should not be a blinding insight. Politics works through argumentation. It works through the creation of discourses which are palatable to the largest group of people. Compassionate conservatism, for example, is a particular rhetorical notion which comes out of a desire to try to appeal to the largest amount of people possible. By focusing on Billig's work, he wants us to recognize the importance of categorization and particularization in the public policy making process. Categorization by these storylines. How are certain issues defined? How are they understood? How are they particularized? How are they analogized? You're going to read something on the Bosnian War. How do you understand the Bosnian War? Is it like Vietnam, or is it like the Holocaust? And each of these analogies comes with a very different policy implication for the United States. The focus is also on the structure positioning of particular discourses as well. And lastly, focus on storylines. Now, storylines, he gives a nice definition of it on page 56. They're a generative narrative that allow actors to draw upon various discursive categories to give meaning to specific physical and social phenomena. So, therefore, we get a very different understanding of the public policy making process, and I've tried to outline it here. And bearing in mind the critique that I made of his work in the last lecture, where there wasn't sufficient attention given to the media, I'm going to begin with a particular problem which is defined by the media as a crisis, as a scandal, as a drama. Hurricane Katrina, that therefore creates it's a crisis, it's a scandal, it's a drama, it's on the front page. It becomes something that the political process has to address right away. There are certain images and metaphors associated with this. Similarly, go back to 1992 and the eruption of the Bosnian War, where you had certain images which then created an imperative on the part of the foreign policy community and the international community as a whole to do something. With these images and metaphors, you quickly get the gelling of different storylines to try to describe what's going on. So in the case of Bosnia, well, it's a Holocaust. No, it is Vietnam. We need to stay clear of it. It's just a civil war that's none of our business. Those different storylines come together. Katrina, the story of Hurricane Katrina. Is it a case of it being a crisis of nature, nothing could be done, or is it a case of institutional failure, bureaucratic failure, failure of leadership at the very, very top? Different storylines get created, and they're often created first by the media and by different columnists and journalists, as well as self-interested political actors coming in to define a particular issue in a certain way. This is the problem creation, and creation in the sense of problem definition, problem specification, how you understand a particular crisis and how you give it a meaning and a particular storyline. And often that storyline can be just captured in one particular image. Vietnam. Iraq is Vietnam. Well, associated with that, there's a whole series of imperatives that, like I mentioned before. Interest groups, instead of having a pre-constituted identity, they then begin to form around these storylines, and they often will share these storylines. And that's what he means by a discourse coalition. It's a group that comes to share a particular storyline. And there may be more than one discourse coalition that shares a particular storyline. Now, these storylines in and of themselves don't necessarily get away from the fragmentary nature, the incoherent nature of discourse that he's pointed out. But they are often defined in opposition to an alternative storyline. So they often get very specified in this process of argumentation between these storylines, so that they get very, very precise and very, very focused and very, very lean in one way. Then you have different discursive coalitions coming together. One discourse coalition which may attract the interests of three or four different interest groups that form an advocacy coalition around it. Another discourse coalition which may be much smaller. They participate in the policy process, and through the policy process you then get a certain outcome. And that outcome, rather than it being simply a policy, it's also a discourse. It's also a particular storyline which is adopted by the administration. So in the case of the Bosnian War, well, they don't go for the Vietnam storyline, or they don't go for the Holocaust storyline. They go for one which sort of fudges it, which describes it in terms of its symptoms rather than in terms of what was really going on, described it as a humanitarian nightmare. And therefore, rather than sending in the troops, well, we have to send medicine, and we have to feed the people who are hungry, and you kind of, in that way, avoid the much larger issue. But it's, of course, a cop-out. And that is often what public policy institutions do. That's how they work. They create these kind of fudged storylines, and they create a script for policymakers to deliver this storyline, which tries to hit both parts of the arguments made by the different people that are advocating for different policies. So it's the importance of not making a choice by having some kind of fudged storyline. Now, what I've described here goes beyond Hajer's work, and you'll find it in the other article, the article on Bosnia that you have to read for this section. Now, generally, what we need to, when we're looking at argumentation and how argumentation works, you need to look for credibility, acceptability, and trust, and how those are generated. And here he uses the Gramscian notion of hegemony. Discursive dominance is when a particular storyline wins out, when a discourse delimits and conditions policy credibility. And he wants to give us other terms like discursive institutionalization, when a particular discourse is institutionalized in law and the bureaucracy, in the policy mission and the operational procedures of institutions. And that comes after a long struggle between different storylines in which one wins out, one particular storyline. Now, that storyline may be a hybrid of the two storylines that were in opposition to each other. Discourse Coalition is one of the key innovations of this book, and is probably what it's known for more than anything else. And a Discourse Coalition is a group which comes together around a particular storyline. Storylines are important because they provide common ground between various discourses. They facilitate the creation of working coalitions amongst different stakeholders. They position actors. They assign blame and responsibility. They cluster knowledge. And in many instances they overcome fragmentation and create coherence. Now, the degree to which they do that is, of course, debatable, because that coherence can be tested in the implementation of public policy. And sometimes these discourses come apart when they cannot solve a crisis because the particular problem definition was one which was never accurate and precise in the first place. This is certainly what happened with the US policy towards the Bosnian War. So a discursive coalition where you have the routinization of storylines in the context of political struggles, sharing of common storylines, sharing of particular metaphors and emblematic ideas, and practices that have been given meaning by reference to an articulation, evocation of these storylines. Now, how do they work? Well, you have to look at the key role of metaphors, analogies, images, emblems in the operation of storylines. They're often defined by one or two key metaphors. You also have to look at the way in which they categorize the world, how they say this is equals to this is unlike this. So people who will argue Bosnia is Vietnam, Bosnia is not World War II and the persecution of the Jews during World War II, as opposed to others who argued Bosnia is a Holocaust, Bosnia is genocide, therefore it's like World War II, it's not like Vietnam, we have to do something about it. So that is those are the kind of things that you have to look out for. And when you examine the article on geopolitics, it does integrate detail on the way in which situations are described, locations are specified, certain actors are identified, and blame is assigned and national interest is determined. And those are the key. If you get those and understand those, then you'll begin to approach an advanced understanding of how discourse operates in a very practical way in foreign policy, and hopefully you will have also got that same from reading this book by Martin Hajer. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.